Why am I locked in here with her? The sound of heavy metal echoed through the dark room. Clang. Cal's eyes opened fast. He was lying on a cold floor. His head was spinning. His hands were chained. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy. "Where am I?" he whispered. The room was not normal. The walls were smooth, glowing faint blue. No windows, just one metal door, shut tight. Strange symbols were written on the wall. Definitely not Earth language. Then he heard breathing. Not far from him. Slow, calm, too calm. He turned his head. Someone else was in the cell. She sat in a corner, her legs crossed, her back straight. She was not human. Her skin had a soft silver glow. Her hair fell like silk, purple-black and shining. Her eyes, large, golden and glowing faintly, were already watching him. Cale stared. "W. Who are you?" The alien woman smiled. Her voice was smooth and strange. "Finally, a human. This will be interesting." Cale crawled back a little, hitting the wall. "Where am I? Why am I here?" The woman didn't answer right away. She stood slowly, her chains rattling. Her dress was torn but elegant, something like a royal robe. She stepped closer. Cale could smell her now, like flowers and smoke. "You are in cell 9A, she said. "Welcome to the collection zone." "Collection? What's that supposed to mean?" She tilted her head. "It means you were chosen, just like me." "I didn't choose this," Cale said. The woman gave a small laugh. "No one does." Cale stood up, still keeping distance. His heart was racing. "What's your name?" "You may call me Nivara." "Nivara, what do they want from us?" She walked closer, her eyes locking with his. "They want us to feel, to act, to give them something worth watching." Cal's face changed. "Who is they?" Nivara pointed at the wall. There, hidden in the shadows, was a tiny red light blinking. "A camera," Cale said. "Yes, they are always watching," Nivara said. "They study humans and other species. They want to see how we behave together. They feed off emotion." Cal's voice lowered. "Like a show." Nivara nodded. "Yes, but this show is real. And the price is your freedom." Cale turned away, trying to think. He had been flying over planet Virex on a small cargo mission. Something had hit his ship. He had blacked out. Now he was here, in some alien prison, with a woman who was too calm, too beautiful, and too mysterious. "You said you were chosen too," he asked. "How long have you been here?" "Time is different here," she replied. "But it feels like years." Cale looked at the chains. "You're stuck just like me." "Yes," she said. "But I understand this place. I know how it works." Cale looked up. "Can we escape?" Nivara stepped close again. Very close. She whispered near his ear. "Maybe. But first, you must listen. And you must trust me." Cale could feel her breath on his skin. His heart beat faster. "Why are you standing so close?" he asked. She looked him in the eyes. "Because they're watching us. Right now. And if we don't pretend to be lovers before nightfall, they'll come for you." Cale blinked. "What?" She nodded slowly. "They expect a reaction. If we don't give them one, they will take you away. And you won't return." Cale stepped back, confused and scared. "This is crazy." She smiled gently. "Yes, it is. But it's also real." He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "What do you mean by pretend? You want me to act like I'm in love with you." Nivara sat back down, gracefully. "Not just act. Feel. That's what they want. Real emotions. If you fake it, they'll know." Cale rubbed his face. "So what? I'm supposed to fall for you in one night?" Nivara shrugged. "It has happened before." He looked at her again. Her eyes were strange, deep, and something inside him felt a pull. "This is insane," he whispered. But it's our only chance, she said softly. Suddenly, the red light blinked faster. A voice echoed through the room. Interaction level. Low. Warning issued. Kale looked around. What was that? Nivara looked serious now. They're growing impatient. We need to convince them. Or else. Kale sat down across from her. He felt trapped, not just in the cell, but in something deeper. He looked at her again, her soft smile, her eyes. That strange charm. Was this part of her plan? Or was something real happening between them? They watch us, and they want a show. The red light in the wall blinked slowly now. Watching. Waiting. Kale sat on the cold floor, staring at Nivara. His heart was still racing. His mind felt like a storm. He didn't know what was worse, being in a prison cell on some unknown planet, or being trapped with a strange alien woman who seemed too calm about all of it. Nivara didn't look scared. She looked focused. What do you mean? They'll take me? Kale finally asked. What happens if they do? She kept her eyes on the blinking red light. Her voice dropped. They test you, break you, then erase your mind. Kale frowned. Erase my mind. She looked at him now finally. Yes, they turn you into something. Empty. A body without a soul. That's what they want. But first, they watch to see if you can be used. He shook his head. This is insane. None of this makes sense. Why would anyone do this? Nivara stood up and walked to the corner. There, she pressed a finger on one of the wall panels. The stone shifted, revealing a small hole. Inside, Kale saw something strange. A symbol drawn with black dust and bones. Others were here before us, she said. Some didn't survive. Some couldn't take it. Kale swallowed hard. What happened to them? She turned around slowly. They refused to play the game. Kale stood now. So what do we do? Just pretend. Hug, kiss, smile like we're in love. Nivara stepped closer, her expression calm. It must look real. And feel real. They are experts in watching emotions. They'll know if we fake it. Kale laughed bitterly. I just met you. You're not even human. Nivara blinked slowly, then smiled. But I'm still a woman. Kale turned away. I'm not playing some sick alien reality show. You don't have a choice, she said gently. He spun around. There's always a choice. Suddenly, the walls buzzed. A low hum vibrated the floor. Time for testing. A robotic voice said through the speaker. Emotional activity. Low. Engagement level. 3%. Unacceptable. A metal slot opened in the wall. Something dropped through it. It rolled and stopped at Cal's feet. He picked it up slowly. It was a bracelet, with sharp needles on the inside. Kale looked up. What is this? Nivara's face turned pale. A control cuff. If you don't improve your emotional output, they'll use pain as a teacher. Kale didn't want to believe her. But then he saw her own wrist. It was scared. Burn marks. Faded, but real. They've used it on you, he whispered. She nodded. Many times, but I learned to give them what they want. I learned to survive. Kale stared at the bracelet. His hands trembled. He thought about his past. He had fought in battles. He had been stranded before. But this was different. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. They wanted his heart. And maybe they wanted it to break. Suddenly, Nivara walked up to him and gently touched his shoulder. Sit with me, she said softly. Let's talk. Just talk. That's how it begins. He hesitated, then sat. She took his hands in hers. Tell me something real. Anything. Kale looked down. Her fingers were warm, softer than he expected. He sighed. I had a sister, back on Earth. Her name was Luma. She died when I was 15. Nivara nodded slowly. How? Kale looked away. War. Wrong place. Wrong time. He hadn't spoken about Luma in years. But now, in this cold place, with this glowing alien woman, the memory felt stronger. She used to sing to me at night, he said. I still remember her voice. The red light blinked faster. Emotional level, 24%, 29%, 31%. Kale noticed it. It's rising. Navarra gave a faint smile. They like your sadness, but they prefer love. Kale looked at her again. You said you were here for years. Did you ever fall in love here? Navarra's eyes darkened. Once, but it didn't save him. Kale leaned in slightly. What happened? They took him, she whispered. He resisted too long. They erased him. One day he stopped looking at me. Stopped speaking. He was alive. But he wasn't there anymore. Kale's chest hurt. Not from pain. From something deeper. I'm sorry, he said quietly. She nodded. That's why I stopped trying. Until now. Kale raised an eyebrow. Why now? Because you are different, she said. You still fight. You still feel. He laughed softly. You're a strange one, Navarra. And you're stubborn, she replied. He smiled. Emotional level, 45%, 52%. Suddenly, the wall lit up. A new voice echoed. Trial successful. Proceed to physical bonding chamber. Kale jumped up. What? What is that? Navarra stood calmly. It means they are convinced. For now. But we have to act stronger next time. Physical bonding. I'm not. She placed a hand on his lips gently. You won't have to. Not yet. But we have to make them believe it's coming. The metal door slid open for the first time. Outside, a long hallway. White walls. Silent. Empty. Navarra looked at him. Let's go. They stepped out together. Cameras turned to follow their every move. As they walked, Kale whispered, This place is a nightmare. No, Navarra said. This place is a mirror. It shows what's inside you. Kale didn't reply. But deep inside, he knew something was changing. Not just around him. Inside him. He had come here as a fighter. Now, he was becoming something else. And Navarra, she was pulling him in, whether he liked it or not. The bond we never asked for. The hallway was too quiet. No guards. No sound. Just the soft hum of lights above. Kale walked beside Navarra, his heart pounding. They had left the prison cell behind, but something told him they weren't free at all. The walls looked clean, smooth, even beautiful, but it felt like a trap dressed in silk. Where are we going? Kale whispered. To the observation zone, Navarra answered. It's where they test deeper reactions. Kale didn't like the sound of that. What do you mean by deeper? She looked at him. Her eyes were serious. They want to see what happens when two people connect, when feelings grow stronger. Kale slowed down. Feelings. I don't even know you. But your body does, Navarra said. And now, so does your mind. Kale stopped walking. What are you talking about? She took his hand, gently. We touched during the spark event. That wasn't normal. That was soul cling. Soul what? It's rare, she said quietly. Only certain species can bond like this, when strong emotion passes between two people and skin touches at the right moment. A link is formed. Thoughts, emotions, even pain, it can be shared. Kale tried to pull his hand away, but her grip tightened. You felt it, haven't you? She whispered. When I cried, your heart hurt. When you got scared, I felt it too. He stared at her. I thought I was going crazy. She shook her head. No, you were feeling me. And I was feeling you. They kept walking until they reached a glass wall. Behind it was a large room, like a living space. Soft couches, warm lights, real plants. Music played low in the background. It looked nothing like a prison. This is the observation room, Nivera said. This is where they test intimacy. Kale stepped back. No, I'm not doing anything with you. You don't have to, she said calmly. Not unless you want to. Kale looked around. Cameras were hidden behind flowers. Drones floated near the ceiling. The room looked peaceful, but it was really a stage. Nivera stepped in. Kale followed, slowly. As the door closed behind them, he heard a click. Locked in. Again. Of course, Kale muttered. Nivera sat down on a curved couch, her eyes soft. She patted the space next to her. Come sit. We'll just talk. Kale stayed standing. So they're watching us to see if we fall in love. Yes, she said, but they don't want fake love. They want real tension, real temptation. Kale rubbed his head. They're sick. They're curious, she replied. This is how they study life. He sat, finally, not too close. Tell me more about this bond, he said. How strong is it? She looked at him, slowly. It depends. If we ignore it, it will fade. But if we keep feeling strong emotions near each other, it will grow. And then we start to lose control. Kale didn't like that. What do you mean? Nivera's voice became softer. We will start to need each other, not just emotionally, physically. Our energy systems begin to match. One heart feels what the other heart hides. Kale looked away. Sounds like a trap. It can be, she said, but it can also save your life. Kale turned to her. Has it ever happened to you before? No, she said. I've touched many prisoners, but no one ever triggered the bond. Until you. He looked into her eyes. And suddenly, he felt it. Her fear. She was scared. She was trying to hide it, but he felt it deep in his chest, like cold water. You're afraid, he said. She blinked. How did you? I felt it. Kale stood up, panicking. I can't do this, he said. I didn't ask for this. No one does, Nivera replied. It just happens. The room changed. The lights dimmed. Music shifted. Warmer. Slower. Emotional level. 66%. Bond confirmation detected. Kale clenched his fists. I'm not falling in love with someone I barely know. Then get to know me, she said simply. He stared at her for a long moment. Fine, he said at last. Tell me the truth. Everything. Why were you really in that cell? Nivera nodded slowly. I used to be one of them. Kale blinked. What? I was one of the observers. I worked in the labs. I watched other species. I took notes. I followed orders. But one day I saw a prisoner being tortured, and I couldn't take it anymore. Kale sat back down, stunned. So they threw you in? He asked. Yes, she said. They said I was infected by emotion. They said I was dangerous. Kale leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me this before? She looked away. Because I didn't want you to see me as the enemy. I don't, he said after a moment. I see you as a prisoner, just like me. Nivera looked at him again. Something shifted. Kale felt a wave of sadness and hope, mixed. It wasn't his. It was hers. Their eyes locked. And for the first time since he arrived, Kale felt like they weren't just two people stuck in a cage. They were two souls, colliding. The red light blinked faster. Emotional level, 78%, initiating stage 2. Suddenly, steam filled the room. A soft gas. Kale coughed. What is this? Nivera stood up fast. A stim gas. It pushes the bond faster. Kale's knees went weak. I can't think straight. Nivera grabbed him, helping him sit. Breathe slowly. Fight the pull. Kale looked at her. Why are they doing this? To test our limits, she said. To see how far the bond will go under pressure. Kale grabbed her wrist. Don't let them win. She nodded. I won't. And in that moment, their foreheads touched. A soft hum echoed in the room. Final bond. Active. Soul link. Confirmed. Suddenly, everything went dark. Cale opened his eyes. He was no longer in the observation room. He stood in a black space. No floor. No walls. Just stars. Nivera stood across from him, floating. "Where are we?" he whispered. "This is inside the bond," she replied. "This is where our souls meet." Cale reached for her. "Why do I feel so calm?" "Because here," she said, "there is no lie." Cale's hand touched hers, and in that moment, he saw everything. Her childhood, her first kiss, her time in the labs, her fear, her courage, her shame, everything. She saw him too. The wars, the scars, the grief, his sister, his guilt, everything. Tears ran down both their faces. No words, just truth. Suddenly, Cale opened his eyes. He was back in the room. He gasped for air. Nivera was beside him, holding his face gently. "I saw you," she said. "I saw you too," he whispered. She smiled softly. "Now you understand." Cale closed his eyes. He didn't say it aloud, but deep in his heart, he was starting to feel something real, something he never expected. Escape or obey. There is no middle. Cale sat on the soft floor, his body still shaking. His mind couldn't stop replaying what had just happened. That strange world of stars. The soul bond. Seeing Nivera's memories and feeling her pain as if it was his own. She had lived through so much. Loneliness, betrayal, punishment. And now, they were connected. He didn't ask for it, but it had happened. It was real. He glanced at her. She was sitting with her eyes closed, silent. A small glow pulsed around her body, faint but visible. He whispered, "Are you okay?" Nivera opened her eyes slowly. "I am. Changed." Cale leaned forward. "Changed how?" She looked at him, her voice softer than before. "I can feel your heartbeat, even from here. When you're calm, I feel it. When you're scared, I feel it too." He touched his chest. "I can feel yours too." They were quiet for a long moment. Suddenly, a sharp metallic buzz echoed through the room. Then came the voice. Emotional link confirmed. Now entering phase 3. Simulated conflict. The lights blinked red. A wall panel slid open. 2 tall guards entered, faces hidden by black helmets. They grabbed Cale roughly by the arms. "Hey," he shouted, struggling. Nivera jumped to her feet. "Don't touch him." One of the guards raised a stick, glowing blue, and pointed it at her. "Non-compliant behavior will result in punishment," said a robotic voice from the speaker above. Cale pulled against them. "Where are you taking me?" "To the test arena," one of the guards said flatly. Nivera rushed toward them, but the electric stick was pointed again, this time humming louder. "Nivera," Cale shouted as he was dragged away. She didn't move. She couldn't, because she knew what the arena was, and it was the place where many bonds had been broken. The arena, Cale was thrown into the middle of a wide circle. The floor was made of strange stone, smooth but cracked with glowing lines. Above him, floating cameras circled, watching. Lights flashed. A crowd of shadowy alien faces filled the seats far above. He wasn't alone. On the other side of the arena stood a tall creature, half flesh, half metal, its eyes glowing red. It held a long spear in one hand and a chain in the other. "Your task," said the voice overhead, "is simple. Survive for 5 minutes. If your bond with the female is true, she will find a way to reach you." Cale looked around. She's not even here. Begin. The monster charge. Cale barely dodged the first strike. The spear slashed through the air, missing his head by inches. He stumbled and rolled away. He was unarmed. "This isn't a test of love," he shouted. "It's murder." The crowd above made no sound, just silent stares. The creature came again, faster. Cale ducked, grabbed a rock, and threw it. It bounced off the metal shoulder. Useless. The monster kicked him hard in the chest. He flew back and crashed against the wall. He groaned, holding his ribs. Blood trickled from his lip. "Where are you, Nivara?" he whispered. "Back in the cell." Nivara paced back and forth. Her hands trembled. "He's hurt. I can feel it." The bond pulsed inside her chest, like a second heartbeat. She closed her eyes, focused. She whispered words in her native tongue, and the bond opened wider. She saw Cal, on his knees, blood on his face, a monster moving in for the kill. "No," she gasped. Then she did something no prisoner had ever done. She reached into the wall. Using her bond energy, she unlocked the cell door with a single touch. A siren went off. She ran. Back in the arena, Kel could barely stand. The monster was toying with him now, circling slowly. He thought of his sister, Luma. He thought of Nivara. He thought of everything he'd lost. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to lose again. He roared and lunged at the creature, punching it in the face. It didn't move. The creature raised its spear, ready for the final strike. When the door exploded open, Nivara entered, glowing with strange energy. The crowd gasped. The guards tried to stop her, but she was radiant. She walked through them like wind through leaves. She stepped in front of Cale, arms wide. "No more." The monster paused. Cale looked up. "You came." She smiled. "Of course. I told you. I feel everything you feel." She reached out her hand. "Stand up." Cale took her hand. As soon as their skin touched, boom, a shockwave blasted from them, knocking the creature back. The cameras shattered. The lights flickered. The bond had become something more now. Not just emotional, but powerful. Later, they were back in the first cell. This time, the guards didn't speak. They just looked through the glass, quiet, watching, afraid. Cale had his head in Nivara's lap, a bandage on his face. "You saved me," he said. "No," she replied. "We saved each other." Cale looked at her glowing eyes. "What's happening to us?" She stroked his hair. "The bond is evolving. We're not just linked now. We're merging." He sat up. "What does that mean?" "It means our hearts beat as one. If you die, I die. If I'm hurt, you bleed." Cale stared at her. "That sounds terrifying." She smiled. "Or beautiful." He leaned back against the wall. And for once, in this prison of cameras and silence, he felt peace. But deep inside, he knew this peace wouldn't last. Something darker was coming, and their bond would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "What is she hiding from me?" The silence after the battle was strange. No alarms, no voices, just silence. Cale sat with his back against the cold wall, his shoulder bandaged, his breath slow. The glowing lights above him flickered once in a while. Nivara sat nearby, knees pulled to her chest, her silver skin dimmer than before. But she wasn't looking at him. She hadn't said much since they returned from the arena. Cale broke the silence. "You've been quiet." Nivara didn't look up. "I'm tired," she said softly. Cale frowned. "Is that the truth?" She still didn't meet his eyes. "I feel something," Cale continued. "Not pain, not fear, something else. Heavy, like you're hiding something from me." Finally, she turned to him. Her eyes weren't glowing like before. They looked tired, sad. "You're not wrong," she whispered. "I've kept something from you." Cale leaned forward. "What is it?" She hesitated, then stood up and walked to the wall, placing her hand on a dark panel. "This prison," she said, "is older than you think. Older than your world even knows. Cal's eyes narrowed. You said you were part of the system before. One of the observers. What else aren't you saying? She turned around slowly. I wasn't just an observer. I was the architect. Cal blinked. What? I helped build this prison, she admitted, voice low. I helped design the bond experiments. I helped test on other species. I thought I was doing something noble, studying connection, love, emotion. I thought we were helping evolve the galaxy. Cal stood now. You created the soul cling system. Nivara nodded. I didn't know how far they would take it, she said, when I found out what they were really doing. I tried to stop it. Cal felt cold, angry, confused. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Because I didn't want you to hate me. Cal backed away from her. You knew everything. All this time, you could have escaped earlier. You could have warned me. I couldn't. She shouted suddenly. They locked my energy. I was nothing more than a tool. I was trapped in my own creation. Cal was silent. Then he whispered, So, was this bond even real? Or did you plan it? That question hit her like a slap. Nivara's shoulders sank. Her lips trembled. I didn't plan it, she said. Not with you. You were never supposed to be here. Your ship crashed too close to the zone. You were picked up by the system like any other stray. She stepped closer. But when I touched you that first time, the bond happened. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't an experiment. It was real. Cal stared at her, unsure what to believe. He wanted to trust her, but doubt crept in. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the walls. The lights flickered twice, then dimmed. A voice crackled through the speaker above. Unauthorized access detected. Alert. Alert. Nivara turned to Cal, eyes wide. They know we merged completely. What does that mean? They're coming to separate us. Cal stepped back. How? She whispered. There's only one way to break a soul bond. By killing one of us. Cal's blood ran cold. The memory room. 10 minutes later, Cal and Nivara were marched by silent guards down a metal hallway. Their hands weren't chained, but the tension felt heavier than iron. They were brought to a strange chamber, dark, cold, and filled with floating screens. Where are we? Cal whispered. The memory room, Nivara said. They'll use this place to break us. They'll show us our worst memories, one by one. Cal looked around nervously. They think pain will separate us. She nodded. Yes. Pain, regret, shame. If we stop trusting each other, the bond will weaken. The doors slammed shut. A screen blinked on. A woman appeared. Human. Young. Crying. Cal froze. It was his sister. Luma, he whispered. On the screen, a scene played out, his worst moment. He had promised to protect her, but he had failed. He watched again as the building collapsed, as she screamed for him. As he arrived too late, he turned away, but the room forced him to watch. He dropped to his knees, fists clenched. Then the screen changed. Now it was Nivara, young, hopeful, standing before a crowd of scientists. I promise you, her younger self said, this system will connect hearts. No more wars, only love. Then the camera shifted to a test chamber where a prisoner screamed in pain, begging to be let go, as glowing wires linked his brain to another's. Cal looked at her, shocked. I didn't know, she whispered. They told me he was a volunteer. Another screen popped on. Cal now saw something new, something not from his memory. It was Nivara, visiting a cell in secret, sneaking food to a starving alien child. A guard slapped her. You break rules again, and we'll erase you too. She didn't fight back. She only whispered, let the child live. Cal stepped forward, touched the screen. His voice broke. I didn't know this about you. She stepped beside him. And I didn't know you still blamed yourself. I let her die. No, Nivera said. You were just a boy. And this room is lying. He looked at her. Why show this to us? To make us feel alone, she said. To break what we've built. But it won't work, Kale whispered. Why not? Because now, I know you. All of you. And I still want to stay. Nivera's eyes welled with tears. Kale reached for her hand. She grabbed it. And the moment they touched, every screen shattered. The room pulsed with white light. Emotional resistance, 99%. Link unbreakable. A final warning voice echoed. Terminate the pair immediately. Escape begins. Guards rushed in. Kale and Nivera stood close, hands locked. The glow around them exploded like a shield. One guard flew back. Another dropped to the floor, unconscious. Kale shouted, "Run." They dashed through the broken wall, down a side tunnel. Alarms screamed. Red lights spun in all directions. Where are we going? Kale yelled. There's one place left, Nivera said. The core. What's in the core? The power system, she said. If we reach it and destroy it, we can shut this whole place down. They turned left, then right, then through a dark hallway that sloped downward. At the end was a giant metal door. Kale ran to it. Help me. Together, they placed their hands on the scanner. The door opened. Behind it, pulsing with white-blue light, was the core. And standing in front of it was a figure. Tall, glowing red eyes, black armor. You've come far, the figure said, but this ends now. Kale stepped forward. Who are you? The figure removed his helmet. Kale froze. It was another human, but his eyes were empty, his voice flat. I was like you once, he said, bonded, in love. They erased her. And now, I erase others. Nivera whispered. They turned him into a breaker. Kale clenched his fists. He looked at Nivera, then back at the empty man, and he knew this was the final test. He could fight, or he could fall. Love in a place like this. The room trembled. The glowing core behind the armored man pulsed like a giant heart, humming with quiet energy. It was beautiful and dangerous. The source of everything in this prison. The mind control systems, the emotional trackers, the torture rooms, the memory chambers, all powered by that one living machine. Hale stepped forward, his voice firm. Who are you? The man's voice was empty. I was subject #1179. Human. Once bonded with a female from the Severa race. Nivera's eyes widened. Severa are highly emotional. Soul cling is strongest with them. The man nodded. Yes. They took her from me. Made me watch. Then they broke me. Rebuilt me. Now I erase others. Before they break the system. Kale clenched his fists. So you're a tool now. I am a protector of order, the man replied flatly. You are a virus. Your love is too strong. You must be separated. Terminated. Before you infect the others. Behind him, guards began to enter. More than 10. Fully armed. Their weapons glowed, ready. Kale grabbed Nivera's hand. We're outnumbered, he said. She nodded, whispering, but not out of hope. He looked at her. You trust me. With everything, she said. Kale turned to the armored man. You were in love once. You know what this is. You know it's real. The man didn't flinch. That's why I must stop you, before you feel what I felt when I lost her. Kale stepped forward. Then you know this bond doesn't die when someone tells us to let go. It stays. It grows. It survives. The man raised his arm. Then you die together. Suddenly. Crack. A bolt of light flew from his hand, aimed at Kale. But Nivera jumped in front of him. The blast hit her chest, and she flew backward. Kale screamed, Nivera. He ran to her. Her body was glowing with a soft blue light, but her breathing was weak. "No, no, no, stay with me," he shouted. She opened her eyes slowly. "I'm still here." Kale looked up at the man, rage in his eyes. "You tried to erase her," he said, "but you forgot something." "What?" "We're bonded now. If she dies, I die too." He stood up, and as Nivera touched his hand, their bond exploded. The air shifted. Everything in the room stopped moving. Even time seemed to freeze. The man staggered back. "What is this?" Nivera stood up beside Kale, her body shining like a star. She whispered, "This is soul merge." Kale gasped. "I thought that was a myth." "It's not. It's the final stage." Their bodies pulsed in sync, their minds connected. Kale saw her childhood again, her dreams, her broken years in the cell. Nivera saw his pain, his nightmares, his guilt over Luma. But now, they saw hope. And with that power, Kale raised his hand. A wave of white-blue energy rushed from his body. The guards dropped their weapons. The core began to pulse wildly. The armored man fell to his knees. "No, I remember her." He saw a vision, his old love, smiling, her eyes soft, her voice calling to him. He looked at Kale. "You woke something inside me." Kale stepped closer. "Then help us stop this." The man hesitated. Then, slowly, he removed his helmet. He stood beside them. "I will shut down the core, but it will destroy everything. You might not survive." Kale looked at Nivera. She touched his face. "If we go," she said, "we go together." Kale smiled. "In this life, or the next." The armored man walked to the core and placed both hands on it. It began to crack. Energy spilled out. Alarms screamed. The ceiling shook. The entire prison started breaking apart. The collapse. Kale grabbed Nivera. "We need to move." "Where?" she shouted. "To the hangar. If we're lucky, there's still a ship left." They ran, dodging falling wires and burning lights. Walls crumbled. Guards ran in panic. The facility was dying. As they reached the hangar, a small ship powered up. Other prisoners, freed by the system failure, were climbing aboard. Kale and Nivera helped them in. The pilot, an old alien, looked back. "There's room for 2 more. Hurry." Kale lifted Nivera inside. He turned to look at the prison one last time. Then he climbed aboard. The ship lifted into the air, rising above the broken tower, the shattered cameras, and the sparks flying from the destroyed core. As the ship flew into the stars, the prison exploded behind them. Gone. Forever. Later, in deep space, Kale sat in the ship's medical bay. His ribs hurt. His hands were bruised. But he was alive. Nivera entered quietly, holding 2 warm mugs of something sweet. "Drink," she said. "It helps with energy loss." Kale took the mug. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to save me back there." He smiled. "I didn't save you. We saved each other." She looked at him. "Do you think we'll ever be free?" she asked. Kale reached out and took her hand. "We already are," he said, "as long as we stay together." Nivera leaned her head on his shoulder. And in the silence of space, 2 souls, once broken, now healed. Together, alive, in love. The final escape, or the final goodbye. The stars outside the ship moved slowly, like glowing dust drifting across black velvet. Inside the small transport vessel, the air was quiet. Soft hums from the engine, distant beeping from the navigation panel, and the steady rhythm of breathing. After everything, after the prison, the arena, the soul merge, and the explosion, there was only stillness now. Kale stood near the wide glass window, staring into space. He didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. But he didn't feel free either. Nivera stepped into the room, her long silver robe brushing against the floor. Her skin was no longer glowing brightly, but calm and soft. Her golden eyes looked at Cale with something new. Peace. You didn't sleep, she said gently. Cale turned his head slightly. Didn't feel tired. She walked closer, still thinking about what we left behind. He nodded. Not just the prison. Everything. My ship. My old life. My home. Nivara looked out the window beside him. Sometimes you must lose everything to discover something real. He looked at her, a soft smile forming. You sound like a philosopher. She smiled back. Maybe I am. Or maybe I just finally understand love. Cale's expression changed. Serious, curious. Do you? She paused, then reached out and took his hand. I know love hurts, but I also know, when it's real, it makes pain worth it. Cale held her hand tighter. They stood together, saying nothing more. But then, the ship's alarm rang. V-E-T, B-E-E-T, B-E-E. A voice echoed from the pilot's speaker. Incoming transmission from the United Earth Defense Fleet. They've tracked our signal. Cale's eyes widened. Earth. He ran to the console. Pressed a button. A voice came through. Calm. Military. This is Commander Suri of the UES Starhammer. You are flying an unauthorized alien vessel. Identify yourself. Cale leaned into the mic. This is Cale Vance, former officer, Earth Supply Division. I've been missing for 7 months. The commander cut in. You were declared KIA. Who's with you? Cale looked at Nivera. He pressed the mic. A survivor. Nivera. She helped me escape an illegal alien prison. There was a long pause. Then, prepare for boarding inspection. The inspection. 2 hours later, a massive human warship hovered beside their small transport. A boarding tube extended. Cale and Nivera stood at the airlock, waiting. When the door hissed open, 6 humans in armor stepped in, weapons lowered but ready. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, walked forward. Commander Shuri, she said. You Cale Vance. Cale nodded. Yes. She scanned him quickly with a small device, then turned to Nivera. And you? Nivera stood tall, unshaken. Nivera, former citizen of the Aliari Collective. The humans exchanged glances. Shuri crossed her arms. We've heard of the Aliari. Not friends of Earth. Why should we trust you? Cale stepped forward. Because she saved me. More than once. I wouldn't be alive without her. Is that so? Shuri asked. Cale met her gaze. We're bonded. Soul cling. Permanent. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Shuri raised an eyebrow. That's dangerous. That kind of bond can't be undone. Cale nodded. I know, and I don't want it undone. There was a long silence. Shuri finally sighed. We'll need a debrief and medical tests. But welcome back, soldier. She turned to Nivera. And you. We'll need to talk. Nivara nodded. I'll speak, but not lie. Shuri smirked. Good. Earth orbit. 2 weeks later, Cale walked through the white halls of the Earth Defense Medical Station. Clean. Bright. Safe. He didn't feel at home, though. He felt watched. Whispers followed him everywhere. The human who bonded with an alien. Can we trust her? Maybe he's been brainwashed. He tried to ignore it. Nivera had been kept in the restricted wing. Not as a prisoner, but not as a guest either. They said she was too powerful, that the bond made her unpredictable. Cale knew it was just fear. She hadn't seen the sun in 2 weeks, and neither had he. The hearing. A large room. High ceiling. 3 officials sat behind a long metal desk. Cale stood in the center, Nivera beside him. They held hands. An old man leaned forward, Lieutenant Vance, are you absolutely certain the soul bond between you and this alien woman was not forced or manipulated? Yes, Cale said firmly. I chose it, every step. The woman on the left spoke next. We could place her in a safe colony, away from Earth, for your own protection. Cal's voice was louder now. You didn't see what she went through. You didn't see what she risked to save me. She's not a threat. She's the only reason I'm alive. The officials leaned back, whispered. Then finally, the older man said, Very well. We cannot undo your bond, nor do we wish to imprison someone who risked her life to help the soldier. But understand, you will both be watched closely. Cale nodded. Nivera said softly, I understand. I've lived in cages. I won't go back. 6 months later, New Eden Colony. Cale and Nivera stood outside their small home. The air was fresh, the sun warm, birds chirped, real birds from Earth brought to the new colony. Nivera leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Do you miss the stars? She asked. Cale smiled. Only a little, but not as much as I'd miss you. She laughed gently. We've been through a lot, she whispered. He nodded. We survived death. We survived each other. What's next? She looked up at him. Maybe a future. He blinked. You mean? She placed his hand on her stomach. The bond has life now, not just ours. Cale froze, then smiled. Tears filled his eyes. He kissed her forehead and whispered, You were the last thing I expected in that prison cell, but the only thing I'll ever need. She smiled back. And you were the first human to touch my hand, and mean it. Somewhere, far away, another alien race watched the last recording of Cale and Nivera's bond. They whispered among themselves. Their love survived everything. It cannot be duplicated. Maybe humanity is more dangerous than we thought. And they turned off the screen. For now.